Hi, everyone. Welcome to the Itential Automating Firewall Policy webinar. My name is Dan Sullivan. I'm a Principal Solutions Architect here at Itential. I've been with Itential about 2 years. Prior to that, I was with Cisco for a while via the TailF acquisition. I've been spending a lot of my time in customer-facing pre- and post-sales roles, focused on automation for about the last 11 years. Prior to that, I spent a lot of time in software development. To developing software for routing and switching, that sort of thing. And I would say I sort of fell into automation just as a way to become more efficient and spend less time on some manual tasks that I didn't really have time for. I sort of continued that here at Itential. Um, Here at Itential, I spend a lot of time working with enterprise and service provider Itential customers and in a pre-sales capacity. Um, I've had a number of discussions with customers regarding firewall and security automation in both the enterprise and service provider accounts. And really, one of the top subjects and use cases that we're always talking about is really security and firewall automation. Um, and I think as we get started here, I'll have a couple of slides to share, and then we can actually jump into a demo. I think one of the reasons why we hear so much about firewall policy is just that it's been really proven fairly difficult for customers to automate. And there's a few reasons for that. I mean, a few of the top ones, right? Multiple teams are involved, causing bottlenecks and increasing the likelihood of human error. Typically, you'll have one team, some security team responsible for approving changes, another team responsible for provisioning the changes, and there's always an opportunity for errors and that sort of thing. And there's a lot of manual tasks involved in that. And I think even more importantly than that is the fact that today the demand for changes is now sort of outweighing the resources and time and effort required to make them. I think, 10 or 12 years ago, firewall changes trickled in, right? But today, with the move to cloud, the increased focus on security today, the demands are continue to increase, and a lot of organizations just don't have the people to keep up. And I think the other challenge is that a lot of the sort of current firewall policy automation solutions really only focus on one aspect of the change itself. In other words, they're more focused on actually pushing a change to a security appliance, and they don't necessarily integrate with the other systems involved. And when that happens, while you might be able to automate a specific change, the integration with your ticketing systems, notification systems, and other sources of truth is going to require an extended manual effort. So for today, we're going to sort of cover some of these topics in a relatively short demo. We're going to talk about how you can actually integrate your on-prem firewall solution or cloud security services with Itential, how you can safely execute changes, how you can actually update automation change status in real time in a messaging system, and even open and close ServiceNow, requested items and tickets and that sort of thing. And we'll actually have two specific demos that we'll cover. So I'm just going to share my screen now. So what you'll notice here, I have the kind of Itential automation platform open, but today what we're actually going to talk about is a little bit of, before we get going, we'll talk a little bit about the systems that we're going to have involved in the demo itself, right? So from a security and firewall perspective, we'll leverage a Palo Alto firewall. And we will actually use ServiceNow to actually help us drive automation change. We use MS Teams for notifications. And then lastly, the Itential automation platform and the Itential automation gateway, which are actually responsible for the actual orchestration and automation, and providing integration between all the systems. Um, but ServiceNow will actually trigger the automation that's actually created within the Itential platform. And I think the other thing to point out is that the integrations that we talk about today between ServiceNow, Palo Alto, and even Microsoft Teams aren't necessarily hard-coded integrations that we've had to write, but they're largely generated based off of open API specifications. And that means that, of course, as ServiceNow continues to rev their API, you can actually keep pace with the change without having to manually go back and adjust things and recode things that you've already completed. So this first firewall use case is just kind of a simple provisioning use case. One of the questions that we always talk about with customers is, what is your rate of change? So in this first example, if you have a relatively if you have a relatively slow rate of change, you're not making a ton of firewall changes, maybe even something like just an automation catalog entry like we're showing here. We're going to create a security policy here. And you can see here we can easily just type in a few parameters. Obviously, Palo Alto has quite a significant number of parameters, but we've kind of got it limited down to just for the purposes of the demo. But of course, you could expand this to support whatever functionality you want your users to have, right? And maybe I'll select deny here. And so, and you can actually you can actually do this and do quite well with this if your changes are just trickling in and you only have a few of them, right? You see, once we've actually submitted that order, we'll get a request. And then we'll actually get the requested item within ServiceNow. And if I actually change the scope of this, if I actually change the state of this to work in progress, what I'm going to do right here, I'll actually kick off the automation, and that should actually wind up provisioning something in the firewall itself. And so before I do that, I'll just jump in here to the firewall, and we can look quickly here. And if you remember, the firewall we provisioned is going to be called Webinar, and you'll see here that it's not actually doesn't actually exist here in the firewall. So it looks like we just have a couple of firewall policies at the moment. So if I go back here and update this, we should actually kick something off. I'm not going to get into too deep about the exact automation behind this because we're actually going to take a look at a slightly more complicated use case in a moment, and we'll spend a little bit more time sort of delving into exactly what's going to happen. If all goes well, we should have seen a message in Microsoft Teams, and you'll see that we see this add security policy rule webinar, so that security rule that we just typed in is actually being provisioned. If I go back to the firewall and refresh that, I should actually see that. And now you can actually see that this webinar firewall security policy has been provisioned. And you'll actually notice that we even added it to the top. By default, when we added them in this particular interface, we just added it in the top. Of course, you might even have the case where you need to insert these in different positions within the firewall. In this case, we just dropped it on the top. But a lot of the customers that I talk to, they're basically saying, "Hey, this is great. It's nice to be able to provision a firewall rule, but the reality is that I might have to provision 10 or 20 or 100 firewall rules at the same time. I have a process in place in which we fill out an Excel spreadsheet. It gets approved by our security team. And then the provisioning team can actually implement the changes." So for this next sort of demo, what we really want to do is kind of demonstrate how Itential can actually meet the customer where they are today. Obviously, if you have 100 firewall rules, doing what we just did prior to this in a single form is not really much of a time savings, right? And also offers the opportunity for even more human error. So what we really want to do is kind of meet the customer where they are. So For this next demo, we'll sort of see how can we actually automate based on the contents of a spreadsheet and sort of have the same process we have launching from ServiceNow. So I think for the first um, part of this, let's take a look at the spreadsheet that we have here. So let me bring that up. Hopefully you can see this. I'll blow it up just a bit. But here you can see in this spreadsheet, we've got a number of operations that we're going to undertake here. We're going to do some firewall creates. We're even going to delete that webinar policy that we just added, and we're even going to modify one. So after we create this marketing rule, we'll actually add some source addresses to it. And you can see now we have many more parameters than what we typically had in that single form we showed. And you'll see even over here, we can even decide where we want to put it. Do we want it at the top or the bottom? Perhaps we want it before or after a specific um, existing firewall policy. So, you might have in your own system, maybe you're using some other source of truth or some other, system like AlgoSec or some other firewall tool to actually tell you how you want things ordered, or maybe that's part of your process. But if you can actually indicate how you think something should be inserted, then we can actually build an automation to do it. And of course, this is sort of specific to today's sort of security guest of honor, which is just a Palo Alto firewall. If you were communicating directly with Panorama, or even using something like Checkpoint, the parameters are slightly different, but I think the same flow sort of applies, and you would see similar behavior and have a similar effect. And from an Itential perspective, we're actually working with a number of security vendors out there and a number with our customers. So the customers that we have have chosen a number of solutions based on what's best for them. And so we don't really have a dog in the fight when it comes to that. And so we work pretty well with all of them. So before we kind of jump in and actually kick this off, I think it might make sense just to walk through a little bit about what's going to happen and how it's actually stitched together. So first, I'll just jump in here to the Itential automation platform. And first, I'll just jump into Config Manager. And this is the firewall device that we're going to be provisioning. So it's been onboarded via the Itential automation gateway. So that now the Itential automation platform knows the specific device and can actually provision it. Within Itential, there are a few different applications, one of which is Automation Studio. And we'll actually look at that, and we'll actually see where we actually have built a few workflow automations. There's also Operations Manager, where we'll actually decide how we want to interact with a given automation. So whether we want to do that manually or define some sort of custom route, we'll take a look at that briefly. And then lastly, we'll even look at the job manager when we have an active job running. So if we sort of click into the Automation Studio, you'll see here that this is sort of the top level workflow that we're going to execute today. You can't really see it too clearly. I'll blow it up in just a second. But what you'll see is the workflow starts at the left and runs left to right. So every workflow has a start and then an end over here. And if I actually blow this up a little bit, we can talk about the specific parts of the automation that we're going to see today. Initially, this workflow is actually going to be called with some ServiceNow information. It's going to be kicked off from ServiceNow, and it's going to provide us some information specifically about the requested item that actually kicks off the automation. And I'll explain that in a little bit more detail. And what's going to happen is, in this case, we will actually upload that spreadsheet we looked at into ServiceNow. And then when the automation is kicked off, the Itential automation platform will actually go and download that attachment, read the contents of that Excel spreadsheet, and convert it to JSON. And once we convert it to JSON, it'll make it a little bit easier for us to programmatically access it and implement the changes defined in that particular document. Next, you'll see we're going to do a broadcast notification here. So we're going to send a message into Microsoft Teams. You'll notice that these purple boxes are basically child jobs. So that means that this is just one automation calling another. So the way that we have this divided up, we have a few different automations here and we'll just call them as we need them. And this broadcast notification is just a pre-built that comes with Itential, so you can easily use this and put messages into Slack channels or what else you want to do. In our case today, we're just using Microsoft Teams. So you'll see here, after we get the attachment, send out a message, we're going to get some of the details about the device that we're going to be working with. And next, we're going to have a loop here where we're going to loop over the contents of that spreadsheet. And you'll see down here we have specific jobs for each row. So if it's a create operation or a policy or a modification or a delete, we'll call a specific one of these child jobs. And then lastly, we'll send a message when we're done. And again, if we just brought that spreadsheet back up, you'll see here that this particular row, the second row here, column B, is where we have the operations. So this is what's actually driving the automation to decide which operation needs to be, which operation needs to occur. Now, if we sort of take the next level down of what actually is happening with this workflow. So again, here, back at the front, back here, you'll see when we're getting the RITM attachment, we're just going to take a little bit of a look and take a look at what this child job is actually doing. And this one here, you'll see, is basically going to take the RITM data that it gets, that it receives as part of the workflow, and it's going to find the attachment ID. After it actually gets the attachment ID, it's going to do a quick check and verify whether or not the attachment is an Excel script or whether it's a CSV or a text document. Obviously, we'll handle both of those a little bit different. For today, we'll be processing an Excel document. And here, we're actually going to call a script that's going to download the attachment and convert it into JSON. And we've sort of onboarded this script via the Itential Automation Gateway so that we can actually grab the attachment and get the data out of it. And then you'll see later on what we'll do is get the data from the script and then convert it to JSON. And then the rest of the automation will sort of kick off from the top here. And then for the bulk policy create, it looks pretty simple. We're just going to make a call through. We're going to leverage an Ansible module here to go out and actually provision the firewall. The delete case looks pretty similar to that. I think we might even have. And so I didn't really put the modify in there, but it looks basically the same. So now we've kind of walked through the set of automations that we're going to kick off and what that's going to look like. So what we can do now is go back into ServiceNow. If we go back to the home page where we start, and then we go to the automation catalog again. Next, we're going to try, the last time we did this create policy Palo Alto, but instead we're going to try what's called the firewall rules use case. So you notice here in this case, the use case is just not really prompting us for all those arguments, but merely just asking us to upload the firewall, the Excel spreadsheet that has our policies defined. So I've got this on my home page, on my desktop. So let me just upload that. Okay, and I'm just going to hit order now. Okay, once I've ordered it successfully, I get a request. And then once again, I'm going to have the requested item again from ServiceNow. And at this point, to actually kick off the automation, I would select this, I would change the state of this. Now, the one other thing that I think it might make sense to do before we do that is just take a look at the operations manager in Itential. Just to close the loop a little bit about how we've actually configured Itential to actually handle the automation call from ServiceNow. So we have this one entry in Operations Manager called Snow Provision Firewall Rules. And you'll see here that we have a endpoint trigger created here. So if we just take a quick look at this, we can see here that we've defined a custom route. So in other words, we can define an API route that an external system can call. And then what we can do is we can actually pick the particular workflow that we want to kick off when that route is called. Now, Itential also has separate a separate REST API that you can use to trigger automations. And so why bother using something like the custom trigger here? The reasoning here is that I can actually go in and modify the workflow or even change it out and still have the same route. So they don't necessarily have to change what's coming in from the northbound system. The other thing that is pretty interesting here, I'll just show this quickly, is that I could also have put in a JSON schema transformation. So I could use this to actually convert the payload to something that matches directly with the workflow, or maybe I would actually use that and I can actually define a schema if I want and enforce that. So I could actually verify and validate the input parameters to a particular workflow. So we have this set up today so that we should be all set from ServiceNow. So if we go back to the ServiceNow rhythm and we change the state, we should see it get kicked off. All right. So now, if the automation is kicked off, we should see something in the Itential Jobs Manager here. And so you can see that we see the Snow provision bulk firewall rules kick off, and it's actually going to be pretty busy. It's got a bunch of things it's doing. So you'll see the create. First thing it's doing is one of the create operations, and you'll see a few of those running while this is happening. We can actually take a look at this if we want. And Itential will kind of give you a visual representation of what's happening. This outline here is where the actual automation is at this particular point in time. So this sort of, if you see this outline, you see it's in the for loop. I think it just finished on us here. Let's see. So if we go back to details here, that's actually telling us now that the automation is complete. But before we actually go and look at the firewall, let's quickly just look at what was happening here. And you'll see here I've just clicked on this query task, and basically what it's showing me is the parameters that were passed in to actually start this automation. So you see we have this Snow ID and the rhythm number here. So if we go back, you can see here how clearly you can see it in the tab, but if I click over here, you can see the rhythm number 10372, and that kind of matches what we see here. And we're actually going to use this, as we said, to figure out and actually onboard that Excel document. So I'll just kind of show you, we'll kind of click through this and see, so we can see what's happening here. So you'll see here that we got the rhythm attachment here. The outgoing data from that is this policy changes.excel. So that's the spreadsheet that we uploaded. And then we basically ran this script over here to actually take that, download that attachment, and then give us a sort of a JSON representation of that. So let's take a look and see what happened. And it comes in here, it's not so readable, but you can see that it's actually reading the spreadsheet data here. And then we're actually going to clean that up a little bit. And the outcome of that is that now we have this JSON document that has each row as sort of a record in this array. So every sort of firewall rule that we had in this particular spreadsheet has actually been actually represented here with a single row in the document. Now the good news here is that this is really programmatically really easy to access, and we can actually do that. Build this up. We built this entire automation just using drag and drop. So we didn't actually write any code. We just make these API calls and sort of stitch them together. We have to do a little bit of querying sometimes and some data manipulation, but for the most part, we're not writing any code, with the small exception of a little bit of code to convert that Excel spreadsheet to JSON. But that's pretty garden variety stuff. So now at this point, we can actually go and take a look at the firewall and see what happened. So if I just refresh the firewall, so you remember when we started, we had this, the last time we had this webinar rule that we just provisioned and a couple of other rules. So let's take a look and see what happened here. So that was the best part of the demo, waiting for the screen to refresh a bit. But Palo Alto was busy during that last segment, so we'll give it a second. And this particular firewall is just a virtual one running in an AWS cloud at the moment. But I think while we wait for this to refresh, basically what we're just trying to sort of reiterate here is that you can add automation to, your security process where it makes sense. There may be a situation in which, hey, you aren't able to, you don't control the whole process, only a small part of it or certain pieces of it, but you can actually automate those and sort of make that work over time. So it doesn't have to be an all or nothing thing. It's a situation where you can sort of automate what makes sense and where you can actually save time and people um, with the automation process. So now if we look up here, you'll see that if we look quickly at the spreadsheet here, we had to create a few different rules. So we had to create a lab rule, so we did that. Then we had a marketing rule right there. Engineering, production, and for the webinar rule that was there, we actually deleted that. And so you can see that that rule is no longer present. Now, one other interesting thing is you'll see here that this marketing rule actually has two different source and destination addresses. And that's because once we created, we also stuck a modify in there and added some more IP and some more source IP and another destination IP address. And then also importantly over here,
I found this on the web.
Also over here, we had this, we wanted to make sure that we inserted one policy after the Itential lab critical policy, and you can see here that we definitely did that. So we're actually able to sort of respect the firewall parameters as well as the where they were supposed to be placed within within the firewall. Now, of course, in most cases, you'll have most customers have a fairly complicated environment. They have multiple firewalls, or maybe they're even using a firewall controller. But in those cases, the operations that we've done here map fairly closely to what you would see there. So that's just a question of mapping the parameters a little bit, but it's fairly straightforward. And it may be that you have in a different system. So maybe you have a firewall policy system that you're going to use that's going to give you some demo on, that's going to give you some information to help with your firewall provisioning. And so you can easily onboard that to Itential and have Itential actually query that and get information from that, and then use that to help drive your firewall provisioning. It could also be that you've decided, okay, well, I'm only going to let customers do certain things, and I'm going to default a bunch of these parameters. And so you could actually have another system of record that tells that, that Itential queries that tells them, okay, these are the default parameters we should be choosing, and that sort of thing. So you have full control over how you want to provision the firewall and what technology you want to use. And we've been able to use, Firewall, integrate the Firewall, ServiceNow, and even Microsoft Teams in the process. For some of our customers, they have, an approvals process, that implemented in ServiceNow using change requests. And if that's the case, it can easily provision ServiceNow to call Itential as part of, as part of an approvals process as well. And you can even configure automations to actually respect the approval process. So depending on how you're interacting with ServiceNow and what your firewall requirements are from a provisioning perspective, Itential has enough flexibility to kind of implement the process that you have in place today. So thanks everyone for watching the demo today, and I hope it was a little bit insightful in the short amount of time that we spent together today. And reach out to us if you have any more questions about firewall provisioning. Happy to speak with you in more detail about that. Thanks again for your time.